They told us America was cruel. But it fed us instead.
Texas, December 1944. The morning sun climbed over the wide Texas plains, spilling golden light across a landscape wrapped in frost and barbed wire. Inside the wooden mess hall, the air shimmered with the smell of sizzling bacon. A scent so rich and unfamiliar it seemed to ripple through the silence like a hymn. For a moment, even the guards stopped talking. German prisoners filed in quietly, boots scraping against the wooden floor. Their uniforms hung loose on their frames, Wehrmacht gray, dulled by dirt and defeat. These men had expected punishment. They had braced for cruelty. What they hadn't expected was the sound of laughter. Behind a blackened iron griddle stood an American cook, sweat-stained cowboy hat tilted low, humming an old country tune as he flipped eggs with the easy grace of a man who'd never known hunger. His name was Sergeant Joe Miller, a ranch hand before the war. He looked up as a young German stepped forward in line. Karl Weiss, 23 years old, once a panzer mechanic from Dresden, froze at the counter. The cook grinned. "Mornin', partner," he drawled, sliding a plate across, scrambled eggs. 2 thick slices of toast. And bacon. Real bacon? Golden, crisp, still hissing from the pan, Karl stared. His hands trembled. It had been nearly 2 years since he'd tasted pork. For a heartbeat, he wondered if this was some cruel joke. "Go on, son," the cook said, that southern accent warm and easy. "Ain't no poison in it." Karl sat at a long wooden table and looked down at the plate as if it were a relic from another world. The bacon glistened. The toast steamed. He lifted a piece, took a bite, and the world stopped. The crunch, the salt, the smoke, it flooded his senses. The taste was home, childhood, peace. His chest tightened, his throat burned. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. Across the table, another prisoner muttered, "Propaganda." But Karl knew it wasn't. This was real. Too real. He looked up and saw the cook wink at him before turning back to his grill. And in that instant, Karl realized the truth. America didn't only fight with bombs and bullets. It fought with something far more dangerous. Kindness, decency, abundance. The quiet power to make a man question everything he'd ever believed. Outside, a horse neighed somewhere beyond the fences. The American flag stirred lazily in the wind. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of bacon grease and the faint hum of a country tune. And for the first time, Karl Weiss felt his faith in the Reich begin to crumble. Before capture, Karl had believed the stories. The propaganda posters that painted Americans as monsters, greedy merchants, soulless and weak. He had heard officers sneer that U.S. soldiers hid behind machines, too cowardly to fight man to man. But now, sitting in the warmth of a Texas mess hall, he saw the lie unraveling. When their ship first docked in New York, the German prisoners had fallen silent at the sight. There it was, the skyline. Steel and glass scraping the clouds. Not bombed, not broken. The Statue of Liberty gleamed through the morning mist, like something out of myth. The prisoners had expected ruins, desperation. Instead, they saw prosperity, cranes, ships, people working, laughing, living. In the processing stations, smiling American nurses handed out water and blankets. Guards spoke politely. One even said please. It was disarming, unbearable even. Then came the long journey inland. Through forests, mountains, and endless plains. Children waved from porches. Farmers tipped their hats. At each stop, the Germans saw overflowing markets, trains stacked with grain, meat, and machinery. Karl whispered to a fellow prisoner, "They build faster than we can destroy." The other man only nodded, stunned into silence. When the train finally reached Texas, the horizon stretched forever, a sea of sunlight and windmills. The heat shimmered above the tracks. The camp was simple but spotless, whitewashed barracks, open fields, fences that seemed more symbolic than threatening. Here, the prisoners worked under the sun, earning wages they could spend on cigarettes, postcards, even harmonicas. At night, the guards played swing music, American swing, the kind the Nazis had called degenerate. But the rhythm stirred something deep inside the men. It made them feel alive again. The German officers tried to fight it. "It's a trick," they hissed. "They want to soften you. Remember your oath. Remember who you are." But even the most loyal among them couldn't ignore the truth. They were fed well. Treated fairly. Given books, medical care, and laughter. One night, a teacher from Munich whispered across the bunks, "If this is captivity, what do we call what we left behind?" The question lingered long after lights out. The next morning, Carl awoke to that same smell, bacon and eggs on the griddle. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of men laughing in a place meant to hold enemies. And for the first time, he understood the danger that America posed to the Reich, not its tanks, not its planes, but its freedom, its decency, its belief that even a prisoner deserved breakfast and a smile. The war, Carl knew, was far from over. But in that quiet Texas dawn, as sunlight poured through the cracks in the wooden wall, one German soldier's war had already ended. It didn't feel like a prison. The men were handed fresh uniforms, clean bunks, and soap that smelled faintly of pine. A doctor checked their eyes, their lungs, their hands that had turned wrenches for tanks, now trembling at the sight of kindness. Even the guards smiled as they passed out plates piled high with food. That night, swing music drifted across the camp from the loudspeakers, horns, drums, and rhythm that pulsed like life itself. Karl Weiss sat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling as the sound filled the barracks. He hadn't heard music since Dresden. For the first time in years, he felt something that almost resembled peace. And then came a thought, quiet, treacherous, and unstoppable. Maybe the Americans didn't need to destroy Germany. Maybe they only needed to show how small it truly was, because the real weapon wasn't fire or steel, it was abundance, organization, decency, numbers that didn't lie. The next morning, Sergeant Miller, the camp clerk, an older man with tobacco-stained fingers and a calm drawl, leaned in the doorway of the barracks. "You boys know there are about 425,000 of you here in the States?" he said, half smiling. 50,000 right here in Texas." The words landed like thunder. 425,000. That was an army. Later, Carl learned there were over 70 branch camps scattered across Texas, each one self-sufficient, each one running like clockwork. Every morning, trucks arrived on schedule. Supplies were logged with the precision of an accountant's ledger. Pounds of flour, gallons of milk, ounces of bacon grease. Nothing wasted. Nothing missing. To Carl, it was all made tangible. The Reich had tried to conquer the world through willpower. America was doing it with spreadsheets. The Geneva Convention demanded decency. America went further. Each prisoner received 3 full meals a day, sometimes more than 3,000 calories, nearly double what a German frontline soldier ate in 1944. Bread, meat, milk, eggs, vegetables, even coffee. Strong and black. Feeding the enemy wasn't just mercy, it was strategy. Healthy men worked better. Healthy men talked. Healthy men went home with new ideas. The camp library grew by the week, hundreds of books, English and German. There were classes in carpentry, mechanics, and language. "You can't hate a man who teaches you to build," one prisoner whispered one evening. At night, Carl would watch from his bunk as dozens of men read by lamplight, heads bowed over pages instead of rifles. It was another kind of army, an army of thought. One afternoon, Carl overheard an American officer bragging to a visitor. "We built 96,000 planes last year," the man said. 49,000 tanks. More trucks than the rest of the world combined. Our factories are the front line. Carl turned those numbers over in his head, like bullets in his palm. The war had never been fair. Germany had tried to fight an idea with ideology, and the math of that war was already lost. Then came the ranch. When Carl first saw it, he thought it was paradise. The camp's work detail had been assigned to help with the harvest and cattle season. At sunrise, they climbed onto flatbed trucks, guarded but unshackled. The air smelled of hay and leather and dew. The ranch stretched to the horizon, fences running like silver thread across a sea of gold. The owner, Jack Dempsey, no relation to the boxer, he liked to joke, met them at the gate. "Boys," he said, grinning beneath his straw hat, "I don't care what uniform you wore. You work hard, you eat well. That's the deal." And so they worked. They fixed fences, dug ditches, herded cattle under the burning Texas sun, their hands blistered, then calloused. At lunch, Jack's wife brought sandwiches, coffee and sometimes bottles of Coca-Cola, the glass beading with sweat in the heat. Carl lifted one bottle to his lips. The first sip was a revelation, sweet, sharp, alive. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You like it?" Jack asked, grinning. "We call that the taste of America. The men worked hard because they were treated like men. They earned 80 cents a day, paid in camp script they could spend on cigarettes or candy. By evening, they returned to camp exhausted but not broken. Not humiliated, just human again. One day, a young cowboy named Tom pointed to a chestnut mare and asked, "You ever ride one of these?" Carl laughed. "Not unless you count tanks." Tom chuckled. "Well, tanks don't buck." Before Carl could protest, Tom handed him the reins. The horse shifted, muscles rippling beneath him like coiled steel. Tom walked beside him, hand steady on the bridle. "Easy now," he said softly. "She's got more heart than hate." That moment, a cowboy teaching a German prisoner to ride became legend in the camp. It was absurd, beautiful, and utterly disarming. The enemy wasn't supposed to smile, or share food, or teach you how to live. But here they were, at night, the prisoners sat outside their barracks, watching the stars spill across the Texas sky. They talked about home, about wives, about cities turned to ash. Carl thought often about Jack Dempsey's words, "You work hard, you eat well." It wasn't just food he was being given. It was dignity. By winter, the frost clung to the barbed wire, glittering like glass in the dawn. The war in Europe was nearing its end, though few inside the camp knew it yet. That January morning, the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Breakfast, mess hall." Carl trudged across the yard with his tin in hand. He expected oatmeal or biscuits, the usual fare. But when he stepped inside, the smell hit him. Rich, smoky, alive bacon. The cooks, proud Texans all, had managed to secure a shipment from a nearby meat plant. That day, everyone ate the same meal, fried eggs, bread, and bacon. When Carl reached the counter, he froze. The man behind the grill was the same cowboy cook from that first morning months ago. Sleeves rolled up, the air around him alive with the hiss of grease. "Morning. Fritz," the man said, grinning beneath his hat. "Guess it's about time you boys had yourselves a proper breakfast again." Carl nodded silently. The smell wrapped around him like memory. In that moment, he realized how far he'd come, not across oceans or battlefields, but within himself. The Reich had promised glory through conquest. But it was here, in a Texas mess hall, that Carl Weiss had discovered the quiet, irresistible power of freedom, and the taste of humanity, sizzling and golden, on a strip of bacon. The cook scooped a few sizzling strips onto Carl's plate. They gleamed like gold in the light, curling and popping in their own fat. Around him, men murmured in disbelief. Soft laughter, not mockery but relief. They sat together in silence, rows of once proud soldiers now reduced to what they had always been beneath the uniforms. Men. Men with hunger, with hands, with hearts. Carl bit into the bacon. The taste hit him like memory and revelation, crisp, salty, perfect. It was the same as before, yet it no longer felt like a trick. This time, it tasted like forgiveness. A man at the next table whispered, "Do you think they're mocking us?" Another answered quietly, "No. I think they just don't hate us." And something shifted in the air. Guards and prisoners began to speak, first in fragments, about weather, about work, about baseball. Then laughter, hesitant at first, then free. Carl noticed one guard showing photographs of his family to a German sergeant. The sergeant smiled faintly and reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photo of his own wife. Two enemies, bound by the same ache. When breakfast ended, no one wanted to leave. They lingered in the warmth, in the smell, in the fragile silence that felt for the first time like peace. Later, while working the ranch, Carl spoke to the cowboy who had taught him to ride. "Back home," he said quietly, "we were told you were beasts." The cowboy shrugged. "You heard wrong, friend. We just work hard and like our bacon." It was such a simple answer, absurd almost, but it shattered years of indoctrination more completely than any speech could. That night, Carl wrote in his diary, "This morning I ate bacon and saw America. They do not conquer with fear. They conquer with breakfast." It was half a joke, half a confession, but it was true. For in that Texas morning, Surrounded by kindness he could not explain, Karl Weiss surrendered, not in body, but in spirit. By the spring of 1945, Texas bloomed again. Wildflowers spilled across the fields, and the camp routine rolled on. Work, meals, letters home that rarely came. But something in the air had changed. The laughter was quieter now. The conversations shorter. Rumors traveled faster than the mail. It began one April evening. The camp loudspeakers, usually playing swing tunes, crackled to life with static. The prisoners froze, spoons suspended over half-eaten stew. Then came a deep American voice. Berlin is surrounded. Allied forces have crossed the Elbe River. The Third Reich is collapsing. No one spoke. Even the guards were still. The voice continued, calm and factual, listing the cities that had fallen. Dresden, Leipzig, Hamburg. Each word struck like a blow. Karl's chest tightened. Dresden, home. His family somewhere inside those ashes. He closed his eyes and saw the firestorms, the ruins, the silence that followed. The broadcast ended the way it began, with swing music. Cheerful, bright, almost cruel in its normalcy. One guard muttered to another, "Guess it's nearly over." But for the prisoners, it was more than an ending. It was revelation. Their world had crumbled, and they were hearing it through the voices of their captors. Days later, new broadcasts confirmed what no one dared to say aloud. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The camp fell silent that night. No cheers, no shouts. Only whispers and the wind brushing the fences. The quiet of an ending that no one knew how to face. Karl stepped outside into the dusk. The Texas horizon glowed red, not from fire, but from sunset. Crickets sang. The air was warm. It was the sound of peace, though not yet his. Behind him, the radio crackled again. President Truman's voice carried through the night. The guns are silent. The cause of freedom has prevailed. Freedom. The word cut through Karl like a blade. What did freedom mean now, when everything he had believed in was gone? The next morning, the guards assembled the prisoners. The officer in charge spoke simply, "The war is over. You are no longer enemies. You are guests until transport is arranged." Some men cried openly. Others stood hollow-eyed, as if waiting for permission to feel. Karl only nodded, but when breakfast came, bacon again as if by ritual, something was different. There were no lines now. No orders barked. Guards and prisoners sat together at the same tables. Men, just men. All of them tired. All of them trying to find meaning in what remained. That night, Karl wrote one final line in his notebook. "We lost the war the day we thought hatred was strength." He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. But as the Texas wind stirred the camp's flag and the smell of bacon drifted once more through the dawn, Karl Weiss knew one thing for certain. The war that had ended the world had also, quietly, begun to rebuild it. But under that Texas sky, Karl finally understood that surrender wasn't just a military act. It was a moral one. 2 weeks after Germany's capitulation, a Red Cross truck rumbled through the gates of Camp Herne, carrying sacks of mail. For most prisoners, it was the first word from home in nearly half a year. The guards stood in the yard calling names, handing out envelopes one by one. The men gathered in silence, each letter a fragile lifeline to a world that might no longer exist. Karl Weiss received 2. The first was from his mother, the second from his old commanding officer. He opened his mother's letter first. "My dear Karl," it began, "we are alive, and Dresden is gone. The sky burned for 2 nights. Your sister and I survived by hiding in the cellar. Your father has not come home. But do not worry for us. We have food, thanks to American soldiers who brought supplies. Imagine that, Americans feeding Germans. The world has turned upside down." Karl read the letter twice, his hands trembling. Around him, other men wept quietly or sat motionless, staring at their own letters. One prisoner from Hamburg read 2 lines, then stumbled out into the yard sobbing. That evening, the camp chaplain, an American sergeant turned preacher, offered to hold a small service for the dead. Even the guards attended. No uniforms mattered that day. Under the open sky, they sang softly together, German and English voices blending into a strange, fragile harmony neither side could have imagined a year before. Later that night, Karl opened the second letter. It was dated months earlier. Hold fast, it read. The Führer promises new weapons, new victories. The Reich will rise again. You must believe. Karl stared at the words, then quietly tore the paper in half. The war it spoke of was already a ghost, a dead echo from a world built on lies. The next morning, he volunteered to help the guards translate letters for prisoners who couldn't read English. It gave him purpose. Something not about fighting or surviving, but understanding. He began to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as translators of a new world. That night, he read his mother's letter aloud to his closest friend, Otto, a quiet Bavarian. When he finished, Otto whispered, "Strange, isn't it? We were told they would destroy us, but they saved our families instead." Karl nodded slowly. Maybe this is what winning looks like. Not destroying your enemy, but feeding him. He looked through the barbed wire toward the distant horizon, where the faint glow of a Texas town flickered. Somewhere out there, people were laughing, dancing, drinking Coca-Cola under neon lights. For the first time, Karl felt no envy, no hatred, only gratitude and a deep, unfamiliar ache for a world where such things were normal. He folded his mother's letter, slipped it under his pillow, and whispered into the dark, "Danke, America." By the summer of 1945, the Texas sun burned hotter. The camp fences no longer felt like barriers, just boundaries, waiting to disappear. Everyone knew they'd be going home soon, at least those who still had homes to return to. The war was over. What came next was harder to understand. One morning, as the sky turned orange over the prairie, the guards announced something unusual, a farewell breakfast for the men heading home. "You've earned a good send-off," one sergeant said. The POWs gathered in the mess hall, newly painted and bright with morning light. Tables were lined with plates of bacon, eggs, biscuits, and steaming coffee. On the counter stood a small American flag, and beside it, to everyone's surprise, a German one, worn but clean. Karl sat with Otto and a few others as the familiar smell of bacon filled the room again. That same smell that had once mocked them, then comforted them, and now finally meant goodbye. The cowboy cook raised his cup. "Boys," he said, "I reckon we had our differences, but you all worked hard and kept your word. So let's eat like free men today. Not guards and prisoners, just folks." For a moment, the room was silent. Then one man began to clap. Another followed. Soon the mess hall was full of applause. Not for victory or surrender, but for something rarer. Respect. They ate. They laughed. Texans and Germans shared stories about farms, families, and the weather back home. A guard passed Karl a cup of real coffee, strong, black, fragrant. "Not the camp kind," he said with a wink. "This one's from my wife's kitchen," Karl smiled. "Tell her she makes peace better than generals." As they ate, someone switched on a small radio. A country song crackled through the static, "Don't Fence Me In." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A few of the Germans hummed along, their accents thick but sincere. Then the song faded, replaced by the steady voice of President Truman. "The Japanese have surrendered. The war is over, everywhere." The room went still. For a long moment no one moved. Then Karl whispered, "It's done." Otto nodded. "So, what do we do now?" Karl looked around, at the open door, the sunlight spilling in, the smiling Texans who had once been his jailers. "We live," he said simply. After breakfast, each prisoner was told he could take one keepsake before departure. Karl approached the cowboy cook and asked for something simple, a strip from the red and white checkered tablecloth. The man tore a piece free and handed it to him. "Something to remember Texas by," he said. Karl folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "I won't forget," he said, quietly as they boarded the trucks that would take them to the train station. The guards tipped their hats. Some even shook hands. Karl turned back one last time. The sun was high, the camp behind him quiet, peaceful. He realized that somewhere between capture and breakfast, between fear and forgiveness, he had found something no victory could give: dignity. The train carrying the German prisoners eastward rumbled through endless stretches of the American heartland. Fields rolled past, green golden alive, for men who had spent years behind wire and watchtowers. The open countryside looked impossibly vast, impossibly free. Karl Weiss sat by the window, his hands resting on the wooden ledge, watching the horizon blur. In his jacket pocket, the folded strip of red and white tablecloth felt heavier than cloth had any right to be. The guard walking the aisle wasn't armed. He carried a tin pot of coffee instead, offering refills to men who had once been his enemies. When he reached Karl's seat, he poured a cup and said, "You'll be home soon, friend." Karl looked up and managed a faint smile. "If home still exists." The guard paused, then said softly, "Then build a new one." That night, as the train stopped near the port in New York, the prisoners were given paper, envelopes, and pens. "Write to your families," the camp officer said. "Tell them you're coming." Karl stared at the blank page for a long time. The words came slowly, as if afraid to be born. Then in careful handwriting he began, "Dear Mother, the war is over. I'm alive. Soon I will see you again. America was not what we were told. It is not full of monsters, but of people. Farmers, cooks, and soldiers who treated us better than we deserved. They fed us when we would have starved. They gave us work when we thought we were worthless. And when the war ended, they gave us breakfast, real breakfast, bacon, eggs, and coffee. But it wasn't the food that broke us. It was the kindness. I've learned something here. Something I wish we had learned years ago. Power is not in hate or fear. It is in generosity. The Americans didn't just defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with abundance, with the belief that life should be lived, not sacrificed. Do not worry for me. I will return not as a soldier, but as a man who understands peace." He stopped there, his pen trembling slightly, then signed his name and sealed the letter. The next morning, they boarded a Liberty ship bound for Europe. As the vessel pulled away from the dock, the men gathered at the rail, watching the Statue of Liberty fade into the mist. Otto turned to Karl. "Strange, isn't it? We came here as prisoners and leave as witnesses." Karl nodded. "Maybe that's what freedom really means, seeing your enemy's humanity." As the coastline disappeared behind them, he took out the strip of tablecloth. The wind caught it, fluttering gently in the salt air like a tiny flag, red and white, the colors of both surrender and hope. He tucked it back into his pocket, closed his eyes and whispered, "Goodbye, Texas." The ship sailed east, carrying hundreds of men who had entered America as soldiers of a fallen empire and were leaving as men reborn. Men who had learned, in the most unexpected place, that mercy can break harder than any bullet. And somewhere in Texas, a cowboy poured himself another cup of coffee, looked toward the horizon and said quietly, "Those boys will be all right."